and welcome to everybody who's on the webinar. And what I'm going to do in this next hour is really kind of introduce Schumacher largely through his own words, or to an extent through his own words. But I am also going to just introduce into this kind of presentation of Schumacher's Guide to the Perplexed, for the Perplexed, a little bit of educational theory as well. And that's mainly because, although I've had a very long interest in holistic science, in the history and philosophy of science, and in the Western esoteric tradition, I would place myself probably most dominantly in the field of education. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Bath, and that is focused on education. And so when it comes to this particular topic, I'm going to bring it from the point of view of an educator in a way. And I hope that will become clear why I'm taking that approach. I came across Schumacher's Guide for the Perplexed some years ago. I'd actually been a student of Goethe's. I'd been a student of Steiner's to an extent. I'd read in a number of different areas. And then this Guide for the Perplexed landed in my hands. And it's a very, very thin volume. I mean, it's about 150 pages, I think. Not a very weighty text to carry around with you. But I think the Guide for the Perplexed, this would be my proposal, at least this is what it does for me. I think the Guide for the Perplexed is as relevant now, it is at least as relevant to me now, as it was when it was first written. And it was published in 1977, so it goes back a little ways. And so without saying a lot more about it, we're going to dive in, mainly because of time. And there will be opportunities to ask questions. Please, like Troy said, put them in the Q&A, I think is what Troy suggested, rather than the chat. Put them in the Q&A, and we'll pick up on them towards the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to dive in. That's okay. I hope that's okay. And then we will come back to share some questions later on. So that's all right, Troy, to see that first slide. So what I'm going to be presenting is, in a way, hopefully being something of a, what would it be? Something like a chaperone through some of Schumacher's ideas, primary ideas. And then at one point, we're going to take a little bit of a twist. And I'm going to talk a little bit about educational theory in the context of what Schumacher is presenting. So Schumacher actually presented this manuscript to his daughter. He was on his deathbed, or virtually on his deathbed. And his words were, "This is what my life has been leading up to." So quite interesting to have a manuscript come at the end of his life, but what he is proposing is a distillation of his life's thinking. And to do that in 150 pages, I think is pretty remarkable. I don't know that many of us could distill all of that into 150 pages. I'm trying to finish a PhD, which is in the tens of thousands. It would be a great task just to distill it down to that. For those of you who may not know Schumacher, I'm sure many of you do. He was an economist, a statistician, but also kind of, in a way, a remarkable social innovator, and really a man with a remarkable social conscience, I would say. And so most of us would know him for Small is Beautiful and his work on economics and appropriate scale in economy, but this is a slightly different text. So to begin with, I want to just lead us briefly into the text. It's composed of chapters that discuss philosophical maps. That's the first chapter. Levels of being, progressions, the notion of adequatio, and he's got 2 chapters on adequatio, and we're going to delve briefly into those. 4 fields of knowledge we may not get time for, and the 2 types of problem, but I will touch on them. So as I say, it's quite a thin volume. And in the preface, this is quite important, I think. is the sentence, Schumacher is not selling a way of thinking, but reflecting a way of being we each have to understand for ourselves. So he's called it a guide. He's called it something for us to kind of journey with, if you like, something for us to take a hold of and make sense of for ourselves. And that's quite significant. So he starts off the book with quite an interesting and I think important kind of story, which is also an important imagination. And the imagination is on the notion of philosophical maps. And he starts by sharing a visit that he took to Leningrad, called Leningrad at the time. And he was looking at a map as somebody unfamiliar with the place. And he was trying to figure out where he was on this map. And he could see several enormous churches in front of him or in the space around him. He could see physically these churches, but they weren't on the map. And so he asked his interpreter about these churches. And the response was, we don't show churches on our maps. But Schumacher pointed to the church very clearly and said, well, yeah, but there's one right there. And there's also seems to be one marked on the map. And the interpreter said, oh, that's a museum. We don't show living churches. And we can understand the context for that. And we can say, okay, we're in a particular place and time. But Schumacher reflects on this and says, it then occurred to me that this was not the first time I had been given a map that failed to show many of the things I could see right in front of my eyes. All through school and university, I had been given maps of life and knowledge on which there was hardly a trace of many of the things that I most cared about, and that seemed to me to be of the greatest possible importance for the conduct of my life. So he is leading us into this book through this notion of a map and how do we use a map to orient ourselves. And he is reflecting on the fact that for him, he started to realize that the maps that he had been given, or the maps that he had maybe taken on, or the maps that had been presented to him were lacking in key elements of his experience. Now, he does a little bit of work here, which I think is important. I'm going to just share a couple of snippets at least, that he's trying to really frame this notion of a map. So he's not saying this book is my philosophy of life. He's going to stick quite closely to this notion of map. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So he says, a map or guidebook, let this be understood as clearly as possible, does not solve problems and does not explain mysteries. It merely helps to identify. So what he's wanting to lead us towards is then some quite strong statements. Again, these are kind of things that we would want to pick up and discuss and play around with a little bit. But according to Schumacher's development of his guide here, the maps produced by modern materialistic scientism leave all the questions that really matter unanswered. More than that, they do not even show a way to a possible answer. They deny the validity of the question. Now, I know there's a few people in the webinar who may want to chew on that a little bit to see how we might get at what he's actually proposing, but let's just follow him a little bit further and see what context he gives for that. In this whole discussion of philosophical maps, he turns at one moment to quote Dr. Viktor Frankl. And Frankl said, the present danger does not really lie in the loss of universality on the part of the scientist, but rather in his pretense and claim of totality. A lot of these comments and kind of statements we would want to dwell with for a little bit. So I think what's great about this series is that the series is recorded, the series goes back up on the Darlington website, and one can come back to them. Because these, in a way, I've chosen a few things that I think one wants to kind of contemplate and dwell with. What we have to deplore is not so much the fact that scientists are specializing, but rather the fact that specialists are generalizing. Again, something for us to carry with and walk with. And I think what Schumacher is wanting to explore here a little bit is that for him, he felt that through his life path, he found that his maps were becoming more and more reduced in terms of what actually was represented on the map. And some of those maps were made by such a specialist view or lens, if you like, that there was greater and greater insight, if you like, into specialist understanding of different regions or disciplines, but perhaps at the cost of a broader type of view. But again, not to put too much in the space here, because I want to begin at least with trying to bring Schumacher's ideas across as they're presented by him. And Schumacher, in the guide, he doesn't take a lot of time to kind of build a foundation for an argument. He doesn't kind of look at it from a lot of points of view. In a way, it's quite a surprising text in a way, because he presents his relationship to where he's at right now with this whole notion of a map, of course, at the end of a long life and pretty remarkable life. And he says that for himself, he's going to share with us his map, if you like. And his map is constructed on the recognition of four great truths, landmarks, as it were, which are so prominent, so all-pervading, that you can see them wherever you happen to be. And if you know them well, you can always find your location by them. And if you cannot recognize them, you are lost. Now, I underlined that last sentence. That's not Schumacher's underlining, that's me, because that is something that jumps out for me as a reader. And this, again, is this kind of working with this whole imagination of map, that if you don't have a map, or if you have an inadequate map, you're going to struggle. But also, if you can't locate yourself, you can't recognize some of these key landmarks, you're lost. So let's see what he says are his map. Now, 1977, so if you want to take the word man at the beginning of the sentence and turn it into human, or if you want to, we're gonna leave that up to you, where you take this word man. Probably better to be mensch, or however we want to phrase that. But this is also quite surprising. His map is based on man lives in the world, but he's going to expand on that and says, and talk about these four pillars: the world, human being and how we are equipped to meet the world, our way of learning about the world, and what it means to live in the world. So he's actually going to, in a way, take this seemingly very self-evident and seemingly quite simple sentence. He's going to open that up for us. And he does that by doing the following. He's going to discuss levels of being. And I'll come to that. That's what we're going to look at in some depth. He's going to talk about adequateness in terms of how we're equipped to meet the world. He's going to talk about our way of learning about the world in terms of four fields of knowledge. And he's going to talk about what it means to live in the world in terms of convergent and divergent problems. So what we're going to do to try and get a little bit closer to this map and the crucial pillars that Schumacher is presenting to us and suggesting that are crucial for us, for him at least, to be able to locate himself in terms of understanding the world and living in the world. And he goes, this is chapter 2, so he goes quite quickly, if you like, into an articulation, into him sharing something that he feels informed our sense making, our map making, if you like, if I can use such a generalization, that informed our map making until actually relatively quite recently. And Schumacher does this kind of turn where he looks, you could almost say backwards, but having taken his glance backwards, he's going to put it very much in the foreground. And what he's putting in the foreground really is this notion that traditional wisdom has always presented the world as a three-dimensional structure, as symbolized by the cross, where it was not only meaningful, but of essential importance to distinguish always and everywhere between higher and lower things and levels of being. And as a gesture, this is also quite strong. This isn't Schumacher's image. This is one that I've chosen. We're coming into a few images that I've actually chosen to try and say, how do we relate to what Schumacher is bringing? So that's a little bit of license I'm taking, if you like. And when he talks about levels of being, these are quotes from the left, but the ability to see the great truth of the hierarchic structure of the world, which makes it possible to distinguish between higher and lower levels of being, is one of the indispensable conditions of understanding. Again, very strong, this sentence. Without it, it is not possible to find out where everything has its proper and legitimate place. So Schumacher is turning, if you like, to a way of knowing, way of orienting in the world, which we might say has historical influence. These are images from a text by Robert Flood, 1600s, Utrisk Cosmi, and this is where Flood has produced quite a number, or at least artists working with Robert Flood have produced quite a number of engravings and prints of what you could say, one could imagine, in terms of their mapping process. And so in that mapping process, what I kind of want to really highlight in terms of Schumacher's text here is without it, it is not possible to find out where everything has its proper and legitimate place. This is a point that Schumacher is really going to keep bringing across. Many things are true at a low level of being, which become absurd at a higher level of being, and of course, vice versa. And this is one of the, perhaps those people who've poked around in these realms. This is quite a famous image or important image, also to try and say, okay, mapping kind of up until the 1500s, we start to see quite dramatic shifts in Robert Boyle's work and Newton's work, and there's massive shifts happening around this time. But actually, right up into the 1600s, people like Paracelsus and various different people, Kunrath, are producing images like this, if we think about them in terms of maps. How did they conceive of this territory, if you like, that they are seeking to understand? And again, like I say, there's a little bit of license being taken from me because these aren't Schumacher images, these are Robert Flood, but it's, to me, there's a very strong element of Schumacher saying, actually, this way of thinking about levels of being was a way of orienting in the world that we may want to pay attention to again, or attend to, in terms of what it might provide us. So he starts to discuss this in terms of the vertical dimension. And he starts to say that one thing that happened after Flood, after all of this period of time, 1600s, I'm talking mainly about the Western context now, European context, what he just starts to discuss is what happens is that map, which has a strong vertical dimension, hierarchical dimension. I'm not going to go into the fact that those concepts and terms, become wrestled with in many, many different disciplines. But with the loss of the vertical dimension and of the qualitative concepts of higher and lower, it is impossible to even think of guidelines for living that lead beyond individual or collective utilitarianism and selfishness. This is, again, Schumacher stepping in, quite strongly. Again, this is my own license. What would it be like to live in a space or time or even mapping space where we have collapsed the vertical, where I think Edwin Abbott's The Flatland is a pretty good allegory to try and get to grips with what that might be like. Abbott, in a way, is wrestling, I think, with a similar challenge that Schumacher is coming about it through his own route. So, and I know we're moving a little bit quickly, but if nothing else, I hope this encourages you to turn to Schumacher's guide and dive in a bit deeper for yourself. So apologies if the train is moving along, but here we go. So levels of being, after this exploration of, there was a time when our mapping systems had these different levels of being, mineral, plant, animal, human, but also beyond in both directions, potentially. And he talks about a time where this mapping system kind of collapsed, if you like. Schumacher's guide really invites the question, how do we restore the vertical dimension? And at this point, I'm going to introduce a couple of things in this slide, and then we're going to shift. We're going to take a little, or in a couple of slides, I'm going to set up a little bit of a shift. So levels of being. Schumacher makes this statement: no one has any difficulty in recognizing the astonishing and mysterious difference between a living plant and one that has died, and has thus fallen to the lowest level of being, inanimate matter. And I find this a fascinating sentence, and I find it fascinating because I'm not actually so sure, Schumacher. I mean, if I could sit the man down, I would want to say, I'm not actually sure that no one has any difficulty in recognizing the astonishing and mysterious difference. I think actually we can say, okay, yes, the tree on the right is different than the tree on the left, that something is different on the tree on the left, something is different in the tree on the right. But to me anyway, the guide is something where little sentences like this jump out, and they grab me, and I dwell on them for a little bit, because I would say that perhaps one of the challenges, and I'm going to build on this a little bit, one of the challenges I feel that we have in a contemporary time is, I don't know that we have a recognition of the astonishing and mysterious difference between the living plant and the non-living plant. I don't know if that's an experience. And to me, this is why something wakes up for me at this moment, which brings to me into the next stage of this. Schumacher's quite careful, at least to begin with. Schumacher's quite careful with his language, and there's a reason for that. And Schumacher's careful because he's trying to lead us into spaces where we may already have ways of seeing, ways of knowing, ways of mapping, our own mapping. And some of those mapping systems or ways of conceiving of the plant or different phenomena might actually be in the way of us having this experience of astonishment and mysteriousness. And in trying to open that up for us, he develops a very simple, very, very simple kind of language where he says, if we think of mineral and we observe a mineral, and then we turn our attention to a plant, to begin with, what we can say before we get too far down the road is that something in the plant is different than that which is in the mineral. And to begin with, he's just going to say X. He's just actually going to invite us to say X. He's not using terms like alive or life force or etheric or anything like that. And anybody who's used to maybe different languaging systems or ways of understanding that, it's quite interesting to come into this space where Schumacher is just going to say mineral on the left. Something in plant has both elements of mineral, but also something else. And we're going to call that, for now, he's going to call that X. And at this moment, he introduces another kind of statement, strong statement. There is nothing in the laws, concepts, and formula of physics and chemistry to explain or even only to describe X. X is something quite new and additional, and the more deeply we contemplate it, the clearer it becomes that here we are faced with what might be called an ontological discontinuity. He says more simply, a jump in the level of being. I think ontological discontinuity is quite a good phrase to work with. And I think so partly because of where I'm going to go now. So I'm going to just step away from Schumacher for a moment, and I'm going to introduce something from educational theory. And hopefully this will become clear why. So in my own studies in education, I came across at one point, probably through a colleague of mine, Isis Brooke, who will be speaking in the next session of these talks. She drew my attention to this work by Ray Land and Jan Meyer, and their work has gained quite some recognition in the educational domain. People have really kind of taken to it and gotten very interested in it. And they focused their attention on what they've called threshold concepts and troublesome knowledge. And what they presented, because as an educator myself, teaching in a university, teaching adults in a lot of different contexts, in the kind of educational space and educational dynamic, you're constantly faced with the challenge of one's own life journey, one's own mapping system, one's own sense making, and trying to get some sense of where the people in the room, the people on the webinar, whatever it is, trying to get some sense of how to interface between one's own knowledge mapping system understanding and where others are in that kind of dialogue or meeting space. So I became quite interested in this work. And it goes back to the early 2000s, where Meyer and Land, they were actually doing research on how to improve teaching and learning for undergraduates in university contexts. This was their research domain. And because they realized that something was happening for them in the undergraduate space, I would broaden it out further than that. They realized that in some of the people they were working with, young people they were working with, that some blockages showed up, some obstacles showed up in the progress into a discipline, whereby there seemed to be an impasse. There seemed to be struggles expressed in lots of different ways. It could be, I don't understand, or it could be show up in lots of different ways. But that obstacle seemed to make it difficult for that individual to progress further in the discipline. And they wrote, they said this, Meyer and Land introduced the basic idea that in certain disciplines, there are conceptual gateways or portals that lead to a previously inaccessible and initially perhaps troublesome way of thinking about something. A new way of understanding, interpreting, or viewing something that may thus emerge, a transformed internal view of subject matter, subject landscape, or even worldview. This is what they started to focus on and started to realize that very often those of us, or some of us, or anybody who's presenting disciplinary knowledge, even disciplinary frameworks, or even disciplinary maps, may have traveled so far into that landscape that we've forgotten what it was like to not have even encountered that landscape before. And we've kind of forgotten maybe it's not so fresh for us, the things we had to move through, even struggle through, if you like, to be able to then make sense of the landscape that we're more familiar with. So Meyer and Land called these threshold concepts, and they describe threshold concepts as being transformative. I would say if it's actually taken hold of, it occasions a significant shift in perception. It is irreversible. So it's such a shift that's unlikely to be forgotten or unlearned, or if we are going to unlearn it, we're going to need to apply effort to do that. It's integrative in that it suddenly opens up interrelationships or related knowing between things that were previously hidden. So all of a sudden it changes the landscape, not just different areas of that, or kind of, let's say, specific parts of that landscape. And they also talk about it being bounded, possessing terminal frontiers, bordering with thresholds into new conceptual spaces. So it's quite exciting to come into this realm in the 2000s. I attended a Threshold Concepts conference up in Scotland just prior to lockdown and the recent couple of years, experiences we've been having. And it's a very dynamic realm. People have taken this and moved with it. Along with threshold concepts, I haven't really talked about troublesome knowledge yet, but along with threshold concepts that in a way, we kind of looked at what they can do. They can transform, they can integrate, they can do these things. They can also be blocks or closed gates. That's why the opening picture on the slideshow is actually a closed gate. They also link it to research into liminality and ritual experience. They draw on research from other individuals to to talk about the fact that what seems to happen as people, individuals start to grapple with these threshold concepts is they find themselves in a liminal space. They find themselves neither here nor there. They find themselves feeling that some previous ways of knowing are possibly dissolving, others are not yet formed. And this can be partly what they also talk about in terms of rituals. Ritual elements of the ritual experience are that what can come out of it is new knowledge, new status, new identity. These are really, so we're not just talking about concepts in like an intellectual or abstract way. We're talking about something that deeply changes individuals on quite fundamental ways. This is why they've gone to kind of bring studies of ritual into their work. However, they also say this transition is often problematic, troubling, and frequently involves the humbling of the participant. In order to do so, he or she must strip away or have stripped from them the old identity. Now, these are fascinating concepts for any of us working in education, because we could be misreading a lot of these different states or spaces or expressions of what's happening. There could even be, in my experience, resistance to what's being described here. And that resistance is because there's quite profound changes being invited or being asked of if one's going to move through the threshold into another space. So in this paper, which I've got the source for at the bottom, the authors actually give some examples. So they actually will talk about these. Oops, sorry, we'll just go back. These, they'll give examples partly from their own research, partly from a number of different researchers who are now contributing to this realm of study. And so I'm not so familiar with these. Precedent in law, conversations with my youngest daughter who's doing A-level law. Okay, that's presenting me with quite a few threshold concepts. Depreciation in accounting, central limit theorem in statistics. So, I mean, for now, these are examples from the paper. If I want to relate these into my own experience, I would say that for me, in grappling with this stuff, one always wants to try and also bring it into one's own experience. And to me, the concept of sublation, which I came across in science and anthroposophy, was incredibly transformative for me in terms of enabling me to move through a threshold that I had been knocking against for many, many years. And I'm not going to go into that because we're going to come back to Schumacher. Cognitive amnesia in the work of Henry Bortoft, I think out of this work, which will feature in the conference that Troy mentioned at the beginning here, that there will be an opportunity to go further into Bortoft's work. But cognitive amnesia for me was profound, and I had to wrestle with it, and I had to kind of see how it sat within my own experience. And now it's almost like I want the t-shirt that says, "We live in a dimension of mind, which is as invisible to us as the air we breathe." Anybody else wants one of those t-shirts? Contact Troy. I just came across another one, metrology and sociology, very new to me. I'm kind of in that nice liminal space with it because I don't quite understand it. And it's changing things for me, and it's changing the way I look at roads and cars and telephone wires and spaces in built environment. Again, very new. But the one that I'm going to look at now is adequatio, which Schumacher presents in his book. So I'm going to come back to this now with that little segue into educational theory. I'm going to come back into Schumacher because to me, Schumacher, in his guide, it's been helpful for me personally to have this thresholds thinking along with what Schumacher is bringing. Because my experience is again and again and again, it's very easy to bring a way of understanding to his map from my map, and then my danger is I don't even get access to his map. The great truth of adequatio affirms that nothing can be perceived without an appropriate organ of perception. Nothing can be known without an appropriate organ of understanding. This is profound. I think we've probably heard this up in many of the previous talks. I know Craig brought this in the context of Goethe's work, and Judith may have as well. But the whole notion that when we're actually talking about orienting in this map, the whole challenge that Schumacher is presenting is it's not adequate to develop one way of knowing, a way of knowing that we can then think is going to give us access to the whole. This goes back to Frankel's statement about specialisms and specialists who generalize. One way of knowing that gives us access to the mineral realm and has revealed phenomenal insights into the mineral realm unquestioningly is not necessarily adequate, if we're back in the guide for the perplexed, for giving us insight access to the plant realm. And this leads to the question, what is a way of knowing adequate to cognizing X? Following Schumacher, aware that some of us have also followed other previous talks, we can say, well, okay, it would seem that, and just before I go there, I just want to do a little bit more on X. One of the reasons why Schumacher is sticking with X is because he's very aware that one of the challenges with words, and he uses this phrase probably from a Buddhist context, word labels are like fingers pointing at the moon. The danger is that we take the word, we think we understand the word, but we haven't actually understood what the word is trying to lead us to in terms of an understanding or experience. Other ways that I've come across this, which are worthy of further research, are the notion of an empty signifier, an empty signifier being a word or phrase that is used by the speaker, assuming that once it's spoken, the listener will understand what's being spoken. The listener, assuming that because the speaker spoke it, the speaker understands what was spoken, but neither of them understand it, and it's become an empty signifier. This is something that then lives in the world with a kind of power that is not the power of the meaning that it holds within it. It's kind of a funny power. This is something I'm looking into still right now. The notion of an empty signifier, we could have a great conversation about the kinds of empty signifiers that are being released or are running around right now. So again, we come back to, we cannot experience any part or facet of the world unless we possess and use an organ or instrument through which we can receive what is being offered. This to me is still something, after many years of working with Goethe and various different others, is just still a constant thing to say, ask myself as I turn to the living plant, as I turn to the dead plant, is my consciousness adequate to comprehending what I am meeting? And to turn to Craig's talk, if you haven't seen that, you might want to go back to it. Craig introduced us to some of Goethe's work with plants. I'm not going to cover that again, but I think Schumacher doesn't really mention Goethe, but I think that would be an interesting one to look at in terms of Schumacher and Goethe, because you could say, it may be fair to say, I'm very happy for colleagues to kind of come back and correct that if they disagree, but I think it's fair to say that Goethe has taken steps towards understanding X in ways that are quite unique and remarkable. But he does so also by saying that this requires the development of an organ of cognition. It's a latent organ, it's not given, and we need to develop that through, in the previous sequence, we were looking at leaves. Now we're looking at the flowering process of a yarrow plant from my garden. And Goethe introduces us to exact sensorial imagination. Rather than looking at each photograph as a static, fixed, finished image, a mineral, as it were, we can start to look at them as a sequence, and then we can actually internalize those into a mobile and transforming movement and gesture of growth. That's a little segue. However, within it, I think there is a very interesting threshold concept. And again, this is up for discussion. Colleagues, let me know what you think. But I think the notion all is leaf is quite thresholdy. And there are a few people who you can come across, biologists, who read this and share almost their experience of this threshold. What does Goethe mean, all is leaf? You know, this doesn't mean all is leaf in the way that we can see a physical leaf and hold it in our hands, describe it in terms of botanical shape and form, or what is meant here. Everything is leaf, Goethe wrote in 1787 in a letter to Charlotte von Stein, but for Goethe, a leaf was not an actual unit, physical, material, carbon-based, but an idea realized by diverse manifestations. Seed, cotyledon, foliage, and floral organs are all different forms of the leaf idea. In 1786, he had written to von Stein, "It is a becoming aware of the form with which nature is always only playing, as it were, and in playing brings forth its manifold life." I'm linking this as a proposal to the notion of a threshold because I think this presents a challenge to mapping systems based on looking at static forms based on number, weight, and measure, because Goethe is inviting us into a dynamic space, a fluid space, a morphological space where things are always in becoming. This one takes it a little bit further, perhaps. This one, I've broken the rules of all PowerPoint production here, which is don't fill your slide with text. And this one here, I'm going to put in the space maybe because it actually allows us also to experience somebody presenting a threshold, whether we agree with that, again, open for discussion. But it goes back to this proposal where Schumacher says, we all have this experience going from the living tree to the dead tree, that there's an astonishing and mysterious event that we're presented with in the living tree. But I would tend to agree with the first part of this statement, at least in my own experience. When we look at a mineral, a stone, and quite rightly consider it to be the way it presents itself to our observation. Sorry, I got that wrong. We look at a mineral, a stone, and quite rightly consider it to be the way it presents itself to our observation. Then, however, we look at a plant in exactly the same way we look at a stone. In reality, it is not the actual plant we see. A plant is really something entirely beyond sensory perception. For some of us coming at this might go, whoa, I'm feeling something a little bit troublesome here, or perhaps this should be troublesome. Consider a system of forces that, in a sense, has the qualities of an image. Its relationship to the mineral kingdom is that this otherwise invisible organization soaks up the mineral kingdom and the forces that are active between individual component elements in the kingdom. I have a plant before me. It is an invisible system of forces that absorbs mineral principles from the mineral kingdom. The result is that the mineral aspect occupies the space also occupied by the invisible system of forces. I see this mineral aspect, though it is merely something the plant, which is not perceptible to the senses, has absorbed. That is how it is even with a plant. When we talk about plants today, we are really talking only of the minerals contained within them and not about the plants themselves. It is important that we clearly understand this in the case of a plant, for it also applies to animals and humans, only more so. This to me is finding a way to say, okay, what is this X that, that is being presented to us in Schumacher's work? Rather than even think about it as an addition, there's a flip there to say, there is something there that is X that the mineral has also come in to occupy. I'm going to leave that with you, and hopefully there will be some questions or discussion around that. So lastly, in the work of Meyer and Land, they're drawing on the work of Perkins. He's defined troublesome knowledge as that which appears counterintuitive, alien, or incoherent. And he suggests it might be troublesome for different reasons. So it might be ritual knowledge, inert knowledge. Now, inert knowledge, I've put the reference down at the bottom of the slide here if you want to follow up on that. Inert knowledge is knowledge that I've kind of touched on. Inert knowledge is knowledge that we have developed over time. It's become part of our storehouse of knowledge that we've accumulated, but it may now also be contributing to the troublesomeness of an encounter with new knowledge. Conceptually difficult knowledge, something that we can't quite get to grips with. These were some of the concepts I think that different people from different disciplines shared and presented. alien knowledge. Perhaps that last piece had a little bit of that to it. I don't really know what to do with this. I can't place this. Or troublesome language. So coming towards the end here, I'm just going to do a little bit more just to sum up, and then we can open it up. To me, one of the key things that Schumacher does, which is done by other thinkers, philosophers, and people who are really trying to understand how it is that we go about making sense of the world that we live in. Ontological discontinuity, to me, is a really important threshold concept. I'm going to place it there, along with adequatio. Nothing can be perceived without an appropriate organ of perception. Nothing can be known without an appropriate organ of understanding. Now, Schumacher, as we get into the latter chapters of the book, takes this foundation he's laid down, and if you like, he makes some statements or pronouncements or diagnosis, if you like, of the current state of affairs at the time he was in, the latter part of the 20th century. Restriction in the use of our instruments of cognition has the inevitable effect of narrowing and impoverishing reality. And he then starts to really actually, in a way, place quite a strong critique of what the time that he has lived in, where there was a shift from knowledge of the slenderest knowledge that may be attained of the higher things as an ideal for our activities of knowing, to mathematically precise knowledge of lesser things. And he notes this, or gives this, he may not be alone in this, I'm not sure, but he gives this distinction as the distinction between science for understanding, science as a way of knowing, science as a pursuit of knowledge, science as a seeking to know for the purposes of understanding, as opposed to science for manipulation. That's a contrast he makes. He's not, by the way, he's setting up a juxtaposition. He's not saying there is nothing gained by a science that allows us to change the world, the phenomena of the world, the substance of the world, to actually develop new ways of being in the world, physically, if you like, or even instrumentally. It's not necessarily his critique. But he does say the science of manipulation was directed mainly towards material power, a tendency that has meanwhile developed to such lengths that the enhancement of political and economic power is now generally taken as the first purpose and main justification for expenditure on scientific work. The old science looked upon nature as God's handiwork and man's mother. The new science tends to look upon it as an adversary to be conquered or a quarry to be exploited. So again, he's not asking our opinion on that, perhaps. He's presenting his opinion on that, and that gives it quite a rich space for engagement in terms of discussion. But in terms of the Guide for the Perplexed, this is the language he uses. Science for manipulation almost inevitably tends to advance from the manipulation of nature to that of people. Again, something that we can put in the crucible to work with. So because I knew that where I was getting to in this talk was close to an hour, we're just going to wrap up in a little bit. But my main theme, then, in a way, what I draw out of this is, along with this kind of the levels of being that Schumacher is introducing, the notion of ontological discontinuity, and coming across this work on threshold concepts, I have become very interested in not just the whole idea of threshold concepts. I think it's helpful as an educator for me to think about the first years I'll see in a couple of weeks' time here at the university, the second years I'll see in a couple of weeks, the third years, the master's students. To me, that's the kind of way that I take this work into my own practice, if you like. But I have another question that comes out of this work, which is what happens when thresholds remain unacknowledged, unseen, or bypassed? So it's one thing to say, okay, there's an experience of meeting a difficult concept. There's an experience of troublesomeness. There's an experience of liminality. And, or, what if we don't have that experience? What if we just start to actually move in a domain where we just treat X in the plant world as if it were M? What happens if we don't even acknowledge the fact that once we go from mineral to plant, we're actually have crossed the threshold or could have met a threshold? So this a state, I'm putting these out there again, just for mainly really food for thought rather than any sense that this is actually something definitive, because the top one comes from Schumacher, Guide for the Perplexed. Human beings are really nothing but atoms in somewhat complex arrangements. So for Schumacher, this is a dwelling in the level of being of M, encountering the human being and seeking to bring ways of knowing developed for M, adequate for M, to understand the human being. And what we'll see in a moment is, for Schumacher, that is a great lack of acknowledgement of the ontological discontinuities. So another way we might come at this would be to talk about the human animal. This is very common. And this is, again, something that for me, I think raises some questions if we're looking at it through the lens that we've been exploring. The human animal, this is something that's worked with very, very commonly. We can find it, we can read it, as we can the biological machine. But here the question that comes up for me is, where are the thresholds? Are there thresholds? Have those thresholds been acknowledged, or have those thresholds perhaps not been acknowledged? And to take that just a little bit further, the modern sciences, in a determined effort to attain objectivity and precision, have restricted the use of human instruments of cognition in a somewhat extreme way to observations by colorblind, non-stereoscopic vision against quantitative scales. This methodology necessarily leads to viewing the higher levels of being, including the human being, as nothing but atoms in somewhat complicated arrangements, as I said before. What comes to mind is Hamlet's great speech about the human being being a quintessence of dust. Is that an experience being articulated there, where we are bringing a level of consciousness adequate, or way of knowing adequate, to M? And I have not gone into any depth for lack of time to M on this side would be mineral, although remember, word labels pointing at the moon. M is what we may call the mineral realm. It would seem that with the plant, there is both minerality plus something else. For now, in time, Schumacher will come to talk about these in various different, using language that goes beyond the X, Y, and Z. But he will say of the animal, what we can say of the animal, if we attend to it, is that it has elements of minerality, if you like. It seems to share something with the plant, but it also has Y. Another element is there visible in the animal, but for now we're going to call it Y. And I'm going to leave those who are interested to pursue this much further. It takes up a whole chapter in the book, the second chapter and the third chapter. But to me, if you like, what I've started to explore is that each of these pluses represents a threshold I'm proposing. And those thresholds sometimes present themselves as troublesome, sometimes give rise to a sense of liminality, and sometimes we carry on as if there had not been a threshold there at all. Schumacher also says the chain of being can be seen as extending downwards from the highest to the lowest, or it can be seen upwards from the lowest to the highest. So here, the big M at the top here, he would say we could also imagine being human. And the animal is the human with this Z piece, not quite as present, developed, or active as it is in the human. We could imagine the plant as human, but without the Z, without the Y. And again, leaving a puzzle for you because of time. That's where we're going to go. So I think I'm not going to talk about that slide. I'm going to leave it here to say, in the time that I have taken, which is just a little bit of an hour, I have briefly sketched out some of what Schumacher is inviting in terms of sharing his guide for the perplexed, highlighting some key elements of that mapping system in this first chapter. For him, those key aspects are we actually, the map contains different levels of being. That in itself could be a threshold, a challenge, a point for dialogue, but for him, this is something that he is inviting us to attend to. He talks about the progressions, which I just talked about, and there are 2 chapters based on how might we conceive of adequatio, adequate ways of knowing for the different levels of being. What I didn't have time to today is he will then map out 4 ways of knowledge, knowledge of our own inner lives, knowledge of the outer, what is visible outwardly from for the lives of others, 4 fields of knowledge, which he says we would be good to attend to in terms of developing our way of being in the world, and 2 types of problem, either convergent problems or divergent problems. And he offers a challenge, which I think is quite pertinent to the times we're living in. And his question is, what ways of knowing are adequate to convergent problems, where we seem to be able to solve them and resolve them and finish them, if you like? And what ways of knowing are adequate to divergent problems, which actually are not served by the other way of knowing, because they have a level of complexity to them, which needs to be grappled with first. So I'm just going to stop there. I know it's maybe a little bit of an, there's more to say, but in the interest of time, just to remind ourselves that Schumacher is not selling a way of thinking, but reflecting a way of being in the world, which we have to understand for ourselves, grapple with for ourselves, or make sense of for ourselves. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that has not been too much of a whirlwind tour through Schumacher's Guide for the Perplexed. It has been a whirlwind tour through Schumacher's Guide for the Perplexed. But I will hand over to Troy to see if there are questions that have come up for you out of that.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was really fascinating talk and really brought Schumacher's book alive for me. Yes, so now's the time for any questions you might have. So if you have a question, stick it in the Q&A box on the right-hand side at the bottom of your screen, and then Jonathan can then answer that. We have a question from Stefan. Why don't you go ahead, Stefan?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Jonathan, that was great. I really enjoyed what you said and enjoyed seeing you. I just have one concern, and that is that I wouldn't want to say that these extra factors, you know, M plus X, etc., that the minerals are missing out, they're missing something that the plants haven't got. I wouldn't like to say that. How do we know that? You know, that troubles me.
Yeah.
I would rather say that those missing factors are missing factors in my consciousness. I'm happy with that, because I don't know whether the mineral has some living quality in it. It must do, otherwise where does the living quality of the plant come from? So I'm not so comfortable with this discontinuity of Schumacher's, but I'm very comfortable with different levels of knowing and blockages in myself and threshold concepts. That's excellent. But I wouldn't want to sort of almost degrade the mineral into something that doesn't have the Z and the X and the Y. You see what I mean? It might well do for all we know.
Thank you very, very much, because actually I'm just going to do this again, because that's the slide I skipped over. This is, I think, I mean, I want your comments just to stand as they are, but this isn't in Schumacher's book. I added this, where to me, this is my attempt, I think, to grapple with a similar thing that maybe you're articulating, is that it could well be that the way that I've come at that is to say M definitely is in somewhere informed by X, Y, Z, but they're not maybe as visible in M for the senses that I have. I mean, the language is a bit difficult, but that would be my attempt to say. And so that what we have of mineral most manifest is that kind of part that is accessible to my sight as I have developed it thus far. But that slide was very much there to say, oh, but let's actually, Schumacher doesn't do that. I put them in there. But more than that, Schumacher does say, what about going higher up the level where there may be an entity, if you like, that doesn't have M, but has X and Y and Z. So he's exploring also other ways that we could imagine this, where we could say, it's not also all been built on M, if you like. It also may be that M is another phenomenon. And I've always been quite taken by a statement that Vine Deloria Jr. wrote in Spirit and Reason, where he seems to articulate that for the North American indigenous culture, the mineral is the most realized of those different levels of being, because it has resolved its appetites, it's resolved its desire life, it's resolved things that we're still working with. We're the younger brother, we're the newest arrival. But the mineral has had much more time to kind of work through some of the stuff that we're still working through. It's an interesting idea in a way to kind of say, oh, look at the crystal, if only I could kind of realize something of that. It kind of flips it around in an interesting way, perhaps. But thank you very much. I really appreciate you bringing that in, because it's very important.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, thank you. I'm happy with that answer. That's good. Yes, thank you very much.
So any other questions? So just remember, if you do have a question, stick it in the Q&A box at the bottom right.
Welcome questions, comments, additions, anecdotes, really anything.
So we have a question. I have trouble with some of the esoteric words. Are some of them and their interpretations only accessible to students of anthroposophy?
Okay, it'd be good to hear which words, because very little of that was anthroposophy. I mean, most of that was Schumacher. At least that was what I was aiming to bring across. It'd be interesting to know what kind of words. Would it be possible to elaborate a bit?
Those which were in italics.
So in italics, okay, yeah, I don't know that I'm going to be able to do justice to your question right now, but some of the ones that were in italics, things like adequatio, that's directly from Schumacher. In fact, it's from Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas originally introduced that notion from a kind of philosophical point of view. And Schumacher is actually referencing Aquinas. Some of the other ones that I have in italics, I'm kind of flipping through. So again, I just hope I may not be able to do justice to you. Ontological discontinuities in italics, that is very much a Schumacher term. Yeah, so I would probably need to know a little bit more of what those words are, because the main piece I shared that would have been, let's say, anthroposophical was the one text from Steiner where he talks about the plant absorbing the mineral into itself. So sorry, I may not be able to answer your question so thoroughly. If you go back on the talk and you want to take that further, please email me. If you go back on the talk, anything that has come from the Guide for the Perplexed has a page number at the end of the quote. So if there's a quote I've quoted, I haven't given the full reference because a lot of it is, I've kind of hijacked the Schumacher's text and quoted it pretty closely. But that any text from him where there's a page number at the end is Schumacher. But please feel free to follow up on that if you don't feel that that's answered. Troy, do you have another one?
So we have no more. Okay, so Judith says that she has problems, that she gets caught up with trying to understand what it might mean and then miss the next part.
Yeah, that's the fault of the presenter and the speed we went at, most likely.
Do you want to just say a couple of words about what adequatio means for Aquinas and Aristotle, I suppose?
Aristotle, I don't think I could speak to. Maybe that's more is that your understanding? My understanding is that there is a recognition, and I think this is what Schumacher is at least presenting, or perhaps exploring. There's a recognition of the tendency for us to bring a kind of conceptual landscape, even a perceptual ways of seeing and knowing, to something that we encounter in the world around us. So I have a rubber plant on my desk. Well, rubber plant is already something I bring to it because I have adopted that somewhere. It's rubber because its leaves are kind of like rubber. But the challenge is that Aquinas and then Schumacher is picking up on is how far can I go to actually understand rubber plant or this plant in its own terms, and to what degree am I actually bringing my conceptual framework to the plant and actually placing it within, if you like, my existing way of knowing. If I already treat the rubber plant as a static being, which I tend to do, I don't tend to see the rubber plant grow and produce new leaves and some leaves fall off. My engagement with the rubber plant is fairly bounded in time. It's very brief. And there can be a tendency for me to say, oh, that is a static, like a mineral-like entity. But as soon as I start to even think about the plant a bit, I can somehow acknowledge there's outside my window, office window at home, there's a grapevine growing across the window. Every day that grapevine has grown another 2 or 3 inches. Every day there's a new leaf and a new tendril put out. But it's a kind of a meditative process or contemplative process to say, am I seeing growth or am I just seeing a difference in size? Am I acknowledging that I'm engaging with a being that is constantly transforming, or am I only actually waking up in the moment of what has already happened? So Bortoft would say, our consciousness is a consciousness of the past, consciousness of its own past, constantly waking up to be aware of something that has already happened, but not the happening. And my understanding about adequatio, and I think this is how Goethe worked with it, is the plant is in a constant state of becoming. Is it possible for me to so engage with the plant that I become part of that becoming? And in becoming part of that becoming, there is, it doesn't deny that there is something to actually be known about my engagement with the plant as a kind of form in space or static entity in space. But it says there will be different insight, different knowing, different relationship even, if I can slip inside the plant as a growing and becoming entity. In order to do that, I need to ask myself, what way of knowing is adequate to that coming closer to plantness? What do I have to do? How do I have to change myself or my ways of knowing, seeing, so that I can get a sense that I'm coming closer to knowing the other in its otherness, in its beingness? That's how I would have a go with it. Troy, if you want to also add or differ from that, that would be great.
No, I was interested in the similarity between how you described adequatio and how Owen Barfield talks about participation, which is another very important term for Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah. No, I think Barfield's participation is a very close and probably more contemporary language for describing somewhere where I mean, the sense of it is that there's a temporary loss of our sense of separateness from the other. The challenge being, in that temporary loss of sense of separateness, there is a different way of how we might come back to relate, therefore, what our experience or insight was, because it's not the same as me being able to say stems are vertical, leaves are opposite, they're lobate. There's a different language and relational description that will arise from that. And I think it's quite interesting that Goethe was also a poet. I think sometimes what can happen is a different languaging articulation, like poetry lends itself to articulating some kind of those kind of experiences.
We have another question. In the guide, Schumacher writes about art. On the one, writes about art. On the one hand, we have entertainment. On the other hand, we have propaganda. In the center, we have brotherliness. This is needed for art. Can this be related to thresholds?
Wow. Very nice question. Very challenging question. I don't know that I would want to, I don't know that I would want to step in with a yes, no on that one. I think because it's such a good question, exploring what the threshold is. I think for me, what I appreciate with the work of Meyer and Land as an educationalist, it would be quite easy for a kind of categorizing approach to step in, or a kind of differentiation. And I think what I also appreciate quite strongly in that articulation and research is the experience. So in a way, the threshold has with it qualities that characterize it, like troublesomeness, like liminality, like a sense of something needing to be let go before something else can arise. A threshold, it's also the language maybe starts to become challenging when we think of a threshold as a very fixed space, like my first image. It's a wall with a door in it, and the door is closed, and then there's a moment where the door opens. I think those serve to a point, and then I think beyond that, we're looking at the experience that we have of whatever it is that we're encountering. So to have a stab at it, there's probably a threshold between entertainment and art. He does have a bit of a go at that. He's very keen that art is something that progresses the human being in particular ways. We could almost say in kind of in knowing within the field of knowledge of both oneself, understanding oneself. Other people, I have no doubt, would argue a place for entertainment is as also giving rise to knowledge, but in a very different way, or understanding. But with that question, I think it's difficult to pin that down to yes, that's a threshold for me.
Thanks, Jonathan. Any other questions? At the moment, we've answered all the questions. Something that just struck me, Jonathan, again in your talk, was the similarity to what Thomas Kuhn calls a paradigm, and how in a way in science you have an anomaly. And the anomaly is, to begin with, something that you hope you'll be able to solve by doing a few more experiments and using your kind of standard theory or your standard kind of notions to in a way solve. But then it's something that becomes more and more difficult to explain using the kind of contemporary paradigm, and trying to explain that thing then in a way turns is the kind of pivot point around which the whole paradigm turns, and then a new paradigm comes about through this kind of anomalous phenomenon. So I was just kind of struck by the kind of similarity between an anomaly in science and a kind of threshold concept.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot to explore in that still. Also because I think when we're reading Schumacher, or we're trying to read about this kind of paradigm shift, to me, Bortoft has done stellar work on that, because he keeps, in a way, he's as aware of the dangers of misinterpretation or misunderstanding, or perhaps in this language, transgressed thresholds. So he keeps warning us about the ways we might misunderstand, because of course the challenge being that if we're languaging the new paradigm in the language of the old paradigm, we might keep missing an ability to really adequately get at what's coming out of the new paradigm. My understanding of that is when Bortoft does that piece of work on language disclosing reality, not just describing reality. And I think in a way Schumacher's kind of struggling with the same thing. How do you talk about X if your language is deeply rooted in M, in providing the experience of M, in describing clearly and objectively M, and now all of a sudden you have this challenge to try and have the experience of X and then talk about it. And this to me is one of the big challenges, and I think why Schumacher chooses X. He doesn't use life until later on in the book. He doesn't go there because, and I think that's very telling. So to have two daughters go through GCSE and A-level biology, I think they're tired of their old man saying, where's the chapter on life in the biology textbook? Because it's biology, right? Where do we talk about this Schumacher says, this astonishing and mysterious element of life. Astonishing and mysterious. And that to me is highly significant, because there's a paradigm shift which would invite a new languaging. My sense of that shift is as dramatic as languages that didn't have noun structures, grammatical noun structures, that they actually really kind of lived deeply in the verb and didn't actually live deeply in subject, object, and everything that we could explore in those ways. So there's a great poem by William Stafford who said, oh, the Navajo's language is based on verbs. And he has a go at writing a poem just using verbs, the all verbs Navajo world. And you can feel him struggling to kind of be in that, to be adequate to articulating a world, everything that is becoming, a world where everything is becoming. My desk is becoming, my plant is becoming. And the all verbs Navajo world is a pretty good attempt at being adequate to that shift, I think.
Thanks, Jonathan. So in lieu of any more questions, you have a short course coming up exploring and X and Y and Z. Do you want to say a couple of words about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I spent probably 20 years studying and working to understand is the Western esoteric tradition, in particular the Western alchemical tradition, and part of that, the four-element theory. And aware of all of the various different challenges that presents, we're going to have a short course where we will spend a bit of time seeking how we can navigate some of these thresholds, which I think that the elements present, but also opportunities they present for exploring adequate ways to encounter mineral, encounter plant, encounter animal, encounter human. And the way to come at that is we will explore that through sometimes exploring some of the theory, if you like, or history of that. We will explore that through artistic means, because sometimes the arts can help with that shift, just like in the Stafford poem example, and sometimes through exercises, really being involved in transformative processes out in the Schumacher grounds. I don't know if that gives you enough, Troy, but we'll look out for that. We're still settling on a date, but that's really looking at the four elements from an experiential, artistic, and thresholdy way.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. So last but not least, we have our next holistic science lecture on the first Thursday of next month. Hopefully you can see that slide. So it's with Isis Book, and she will be talking about engaging with plant agency. And that's on Thursday, the 7th of October at 4 p.m. So I think that's all from us today. And I look forward to seeing many of you here next month. So thanks a lot, Jonathan. That was a really fascinating talk. And I look forward to, I look forward to your short course coming up in the near future. Okay,
Right,
bye
thanks.
then. Thank you.